Hi, everybody, and welcome to Headway, a show that informs our audience about political issues that affect the nation, the region, and our local area. On this episode, I will be speaking with Christopher Rotondo, Director of Organizing, Communications, and Development at D.A.R.E, Direct Action for Rights and Equality. Chris and I are going to discuss D.A.R.E's Tenant and Homeowner Association. Welcome everybody back to Headway. Like I mentioned in the opener, we're here with Christopher from D.A.R.E, and today we're going to talk about D.A.R.E's Tenants Homeowner Association. Welcome, Christopher. How are you today?
All right. How are you?
I'm good. So can you just start off telling me what D.A.R.E is actually, and then we can get into the Homeowner Association later.
Yeah. So it's not the anti-drug program some folks experience in middle school. D.A.R.E stands for Direct Action for Rights and Equality, which is the name that members of the organization gave to the organization after a few years of it going around the neighborhood. So D.A.R.E is an organization that works with low-income families and communities of color for social, economic, and political justice. It was founded in 1986 in the south side of Providence by a small handful of women who live in the neighborhood, focused on cleaning up a local park, and it expanded into a nonprofit organization that's dealt with many different campaign issues. We call them direct action organizing campaigns over time. So around police brutality, around organizing home daycare providers, criminal justice reform in a campaign called Behind the Walls. And most recently, around 2009, we adopted the Tenant and Homeowner Association, which was doing anti-foreclosure work at the time and has transitioned into tenants' rights and anti-displacement work over the course of the last decade or so.
So what are some of the initiatives that the Tenant Homeowners Association is working on now?
Yeah, so currently, we develop ideas and campaign initiatives from our membership who are all impacted by evictions and unaffordable housing and insecurity in their housing, homelessness, former and current. So folks have landed on currently an ordinance for the city of Providence that establishes what we call rent stabilization, but generally, it's fair to call it rent control. So it established a system where rents could only go up by a certain percentage once per year, and establishes a rent board that would mediate disputes between landlords and tenants, and some other protections for tenants and different regulations around the landlord-tenant relationship. So this is the kind of campaigns going on around the country. California has a lot of new ordinances, has a statewide law. Oregon has a statewide law as well. So really trying to limit arbitrary rent increases that are really based on landlords trying to profit from a market, like students or wealthy commuters from Boston or other wealthier folks that might want to move into the neighborhoods or the city in places where historically low-income Black and Indigenous and people of color have been living.
So can you talk about historically with D.A.R.E? So you said the Tenant Homeowner Association started in 2000, right? So since 2000, were there any like major accomplishments that you guys have made happen?
Yeah, I would say 2000 is a little too early. I think the THA started in 2007.
Oh, sorry.
Actually, outside of D.A.R.E. Yeah, so in response to the sort of nationwide foreclosure crisis and how it was impacting communities of color in Rhode Island, so it actually started another nonprofit. What had happened was the folks hired to do that work had organized some tenants and homeowners who had been impacted by foreclosure, and those folks really wanted to see state legislation change. They wanted to see a law that we ended up calling Just Cause enacted in the state, and that would prevent banks from evicting former owners or tenants who lived in properties that got foreclosed on and that the bank took over. So when a foreclosure happens, the bank might take the house back and basically take a loss, or they might sell it to someone on the street at an auction. So when houses don't sell, a lot of the houses ended up going to the hands of banks. So those banks were just blanket evicting the residents without cause. So this law was created with the help of legal services in Rhode Island and pushed at the legislature called Just Cause, meaning the banks would have to have a reason or a just cause, according to the law, to evict any residents in the building rather than abandon the property just so they didn't have liability or so they didn't have to deal with maintenance issues. They would have to maintain tenants and former owners as tenants until they turn the property over to someone else, and then they changed hands and things could change. But just create some sort of legal recourse for residents as opposed to just these blanket no fault evictions. A lot of illegal things were going on as well. So in 2014, after about 5 or 6 years of advocating for this law, we actually did get it passed. So it was compromise legislation. It doesn't apply to former homeowners who might be living in the home still, but it does apply to all bona fide tenants. So any tenant that's in good standing, that can prove their tenancy, was paying rent to the prior owner, they're now legally allowed to stay in the property, pay rent to the bank, and they can sort of expect mandatory conditions to be maintained, health and safety standards, just like any other landlord. So it basically holds banks and mortgage lenders accountable to our state's Landlord Tenant Act. So they can't just act sort of wild, wild west style towards their tenants when they take over. So that was a big legislative accomplishment in 2014. Since then, we've been focused at the city level. We've won changes to ordinances around how the city's agencies use eminent domain, fought for changes in rules around how the city will take property and put them in receivership, turn them over to attorneys appointed by the state, and then flip them to investors because they're abandoned or they're blighted. People are losing their homes in that way. We've established some momentum around this rent control initiative, and have actually worked with, I think at this point, thousands of low-income renters and owners just to prevent individual evictions and foreclosures, right? To maintain people in place, to give them an alternative and prevent just a mass wave of evictions. We're also working on development projects. So D.A.R.E is often opposed this sort of tax stabilization system in Providence, which gives big 12-year tax breaks to developers who build hotels or high-end luxury apartments without any sort of community benefits. I mean, so unlike Massachusetts or Boston, there's no zoning requirement that they build low-income housing when they build high-end housing in the same property, or that they pay into a fund, or that they hire locally. There is a local hiring law that's not followed. So we've been on that for some time. And I think now the political terrain is shifting in favor of modifying those agreements or discontinuing them altogether. Next week, we're actually going to get out in the street as safely as possible and oppose a development right around the corner from us that proposes, $1,400 to $1,800 one-bedroom apartments for a former Citizens Bank that's across from the biggest high school in Providence, where 80% of the students are low-income, Black, Indigenous, and kids of color.
So where is that? What street is that on?
The old Citizens Bank is right at the corner of Westminster and Cranston Streets. So If you're at Central High School, You look across the street. It's right at a very busy intersection, kind of at the heart of both the South Side and West End neighborhoods. It's kind of where they intersect. And both of those neighborhoods are historic bases of D.A.R.E, historic Black and, Indigenous communities, Dominican immigrants, and for the West End, for a period of time, Cambodian refugees are resettled there after the Khmer Rouge. So a mixed neighborhood of folks in the West End is really going through a lot of gentrification pressures, a lot of demographic change. Things are getting more expensive. So I think that's why this development's attractive to a private developer like the Omni Group.
Yeah. So do you see when one developer comes in, do you see it kind of as a domino effect of like, oh, we can charge high rents in this area, so then more and more stuff starts happening, groups start buying up like triple deckers or whatever, multifamily places, and just fixing them up or whatever, trying to do the same thing, trying to gentrify it even more?
Yeah, I think that it's been, the context for this really is rooted in our foreclosure work. We would go to protest foreclosure auctions, and we'd see a immigrant family that lived on the first floor and rented out the other two floors of a 3-decker house in Washington Park, or a historic neighborhood that had been populated by lower income people of color for some time. And investors would come to flip the house for 2 or 3 times what it was worth when these folks bought it. They'd have no recourse. They'd be bought out for maybe missing 6 months of mortgage payments, or maybe because they were in a subprime situation. So that enabled a situation where investors could buy. They could either flip property, or they could rent to students at Johnson & Wales or Brown University students, or even Bryant, which is actually out in Smithfield. So they would rent to students who would pay by the bedroom. They could double or triple their rent. They wouldn't invest in the property, so it would go into disrepair. And the surrounding neighbors would become less desirable for the families that still stayed, and then it would become upward pressure on rent for people that were looking for a place to rent, because they would know, the owners would become aware that next door, they were charging 2 or 3 times the rent. And without regulation, it's what the market will bear. So people either turn to student rentals, or they just charge regular folks way more money. So that fallout left a ton of property available to these investors, right? People losing their homes to foreclosure, which is something we fought. And when we shifted into tenants' rights work, we saw that all these folks that had been foreclosed, who used to own property, right? Homeowning families were forced into a rental market where these regulations didn't exist, where these pressures existed to pay high rents, and where landlords were kind of evicting folks for vindictive reasons or retaliatory reasons because they didn't want to maintain code standards or fix things, or they had some beef with the tenant, they took out on them in the form of an eviction, right? Legal or otherwise. So these folks entered this wild, wild west of a market. So we teamed up with a couple of legal service agencies, RILs, and then a new place called the Center for Justice to take tenant cases to court. So roughly estimated 90% of tenants that go to court for eviction are unrepresented, and then 90% of landlords are represented. So people are already at a disadvantage going in. The court's not set up to give tenants the information on their basic rights, how they can raise defenses to an eviction, and often judges don't listen to their defenses. I've talked to tenants who have pictures of infestations, pictures of unsafe conditions, harassing text messages and threats from landlords that are illegal, and they still lose in court, right? So we're up against this system, and I think developers see opportunity, right? They can buy land and property cheaply. The city is going out of its way to subsidize these developments and move it through zoning or give it a tax break, right? Because they want to see the neighborhood look better, right? And they're really not concerned with who moves into those condos or those units, and what is behind the superficial veneer of a new building, right? Or of a nice place that'll be marketed a certain kind of way. So it's kind of an economic paradigm for the city, and administration after administration continues to do this, whether it's high-end hotel development downtown that doesn't produce jobs or economic well-being for folks in our neighborhoods, or it's luxury development even in the neighborhoods, right? There really isn't a plan or a concern for the folks already there who might be experiencing homelessness, in South Providence and around that development. People live in the street. People know the people who have no place to go. They might stay in a shelter, they may not be able to, and they're going to be around. They're literally going to be 50 yards from that building panhandling, right? And the folks that are house hopping are just barely making it by month to month in substandard housing. So the city is really not invested in housing its folks, and it is invested in subsidizing these properties. So there's a big context going on. So we're kind of fighting on many fronts.
Yeah, I saw that one of the things that I found really interesting that you guys are working on is something I didn't even kind of think of as an issue, but obviously is you're doing work on income source discrimination legislation. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, what that is, and why that's important?
Yeah, I think there's another, Rhode Island Housing, to their credit, has been championing that legislation at the State House and putting their lobbyists and their power behind it. But we have a lot of members, right, who have Section 8 vouchers, who have other subsidies that help them pay their rent, and they'll experience basically how would I put this, an obscure or a cover form of racial discrimination or class discrimination, right? That folks who have vouchers are assumed to be predominantly Black or assumed to be predominantly poor otherwise. They do income qualify for a voucher, so, are otherwise bad tenants, right? And so landlords have this not illegal cover to discriminate against folks who they see are using a voucher. Say, well, I don't want to do the paperwork for Section 8 because they may actually make me bring my property up to code. They may make me fix this or fix that. And there's also a libertarian streak in a lot of property owners who don't trust the government allegedly, or don't want to deal with the government. They want to do with their property what they want. So they want to charge whatever they want. And Section 8 has rent limits. But a lot of times it's just folks that are discriminating against women with children, discriminating against Black folks, discriminating against immigrants, other folks that they don't like for a variety of reasons. They can use this income source discrimination as a legal form of just outright discrimination, because it's not illegal to tell someone, well, I'm not going to take your voucher, or I don't like that you're on SSI, or you need to have 3 times the income and show me your pay stubs, or else you can't have this apartment. That's not illegal in the state of Rhode Island, despite it being illegal in most, 2 or 3 of the other New England states. So landlords are really getting away with something. And it's unfortunate because these are the folks that actually have guaranteed rent. They have a subsidized way to pay their rent. It's guaranteed income for a landlord, right? It comes with requirements. Those requirements are sort of basic human dignity for the tenant. Yeah. And then people are just turned away. So people have to turn their vouchers back over. People have to go kind of for the lowest common denominator. They're kind of like creating shady situations in illegal apartments, or working with landlords that really are not above board and don't intend to be, because they have so few options. Again, that's that unregulated private market situation that we have.
Yeah, no, so I feel like part of the reason the vouchers exist, tell me if I'm wrong, but part of the reason the vouchers exist is so that low-income people aren't just living in low-income housing developments where they can be out in different communities, they can spread out, their kids can have opportunities in different schools and not just in this one area where if you condense low-income people, like services are going to be worse if they're all condensed in one area. So with the voucher system, maybe they can get out into different areas, and if HUD's paying that, they can. Yeah, there's low income housing all over the place. But when if landlords are not accepting the vouchers, like that whole part is taken away, right?
Yeah, and I think there are, the voucher program had good intentions. I think there are deep structural elements that, whether it's honest ignorance or blissful ignorance don't account for, right? So you put a voucher in someone's hands. A lot of times, even on the east side of Providence, the market rate for the voucher, the limit on rent, doesn't accommodate the market rate in that neighborhood, right? So even if folks are saying, I want to move to this wealthier neighborhood with better access to schools for my kids and just a better environment, they're not going to be able to get in, one, because they won't have the funds, because the voucher won't cover that much rent and the landlords know it. And two, it doesn't account for the lack of regulation on landlords who might discriminate in one way or another. It doesn't account for suburban neighborhoods that aren't even zoned to build multifamily properties. So there's no way your voucher is going to cover renting a single family home on 20 acres in Smithfield, right? So all of these structural things that are built into local and state law just make it so that, someone may have a voucher in their hand, but all of those racial and class and gender discrimination elements that exist are still baked into the policy and a lot of times into the ideology of the people they might be renting from. So the voucher has proven not enough. The statistics show that it hasn't dispersed poor folks of color into better neighborhoods and desegregated our country or our state. What it's really done is concentrated a bunch of people into kind of lower quality, unregulated housing in those same neighborhoods, or the neighborhoods that have shifted, right, geographically as people move in and out of the urban cities. So it's unfortunate that capitalism continues to shuffle this problem around, right? Whereas we're advocating for things where cities and towns are forced to build affordable housing of a certain percentage, right? Getting rid of these discriminatory laws and elements and zoning regulations that prevent people from moving in. I think at D.A.R.E, we struggle a lot to get deeper than the superficial, right? To point out root cause situations, to point out the real underlying factors that are creating, this mass incarceration situation, or the situation where folks with vouchers can't even find housing, right? And the politicians, a lot of mainstream nonprofits, advocates, they don't jive with us on that level. They're not willing. They're either understanding but not willing to push to that level, and sometimes they want to win so bad, or they have just a different ideology that they're willing to go for the lower hanging fruit. So we find ourselves outliers often in pushing for those structural changes that we know long-term are going to matter to our folks, and that our folks honestly won't let us get away without doing. So our members are always keen to point out where we're not doing enough. People are still struggling, and we're not attacking the root cause of white supremacy and racism. So we answer them, and we always try to push as hard as possible.
That's great. That's great. So going back to gentrification in a way, can you talk about what your thoughts on opportunity zones are, and like how that might affect, building of those kind of like the apartment complexes you were talking about of higher rent, and if like opportunity zones kind of exacerbates that problem?
Yeah, I think I grew up in the world of the WTO and the free economic zone and globalization. So I call that what it is. It's just another form of deep capitalist exploitation. So it's a question, our members would always ask, an opportunity for who? To their credit, they're always asking, who gets that apartment? Do I know them? Are they a member of my family? Because people in Providence are all connected, right? Black folks, people who are immigrants, they're all connected familially or have grown up together. And so if they don't know someone who lives there, if they don't have direct evidence that it's good for them, and they end up seeing a lot of white people walking their dogs in the neighborhood all of a sudden, they know, they call a spade a spade. They know what it is. So if the opportunity is for any private developer who puts in a bid to jump through some hoops, and the city is not going to put regulations on it to demand that they hire local unemployed folks, that they put, a cap on rent so that, the actual numbers in the neighborhood make sense, because the city knows the unemployment rates. They know what people make in South Providence is 60% less than the median income of the state or even the city. They know these things, but they refuse to regulate private business to the point where those developments, even in these zones that they say need development, are actually going to benefit the residents. So they're already setting up a situation where people with more money from outside are going to come in, right? And we know we don't need that. We need to house the people who are living on the street in those neighborhoods right now. And for the folks that are doubled up, or the folks that are one accident or rent increase away from homelessness, they need to be housed. And then we can talk about bringing in more tax revenue from rich folks from Boston, or we can, we can rent to other folks. I mean, the amazing story about this is how many of those downtown condos or city subsidized developments go empty. A lot of the ones downtown on the river were sold to Johnson & Wales as dorms. These rich folks are not going to move to Providence so that they can commute to Boston. They have options, and we hear from city council all the time, well, if we build them luxury housing that they can afford, then they won't buy a house in Washington Park and price out poor folks. My answer to that is always they're going to do both, right? If they have the opportunity, why would they do one or the other? You're not creating a situation where you're making sure people are housed and making sure gentrification doesn't happen. You're just hoping for the best and kind of catering to the wealthy proclivities of a developer or someone that might be moving here, and it's really frustrating because I think most of our members have seen this for 3 decades, my entire lifetime. They've lived through this, and it doesn't seem to change. Administration after administration or council after council seems to share the same fundamental belief in neoliberal capitalism. And I always hope that in the moment we're kind of cresting that and we're getting to a place where more people on the council are over that or beyond that ideologically. But, it's hard.
Yeah. The whole idea of, like back in the Cianci administration, people were like, oh, we cleaned up Providence, look how beautiful it was. And it's like, yeah, downtown, like it looked nice, you know what I mean? But if you're not fixing the economic situation in the entire city, it's like, it doesn't matter, right? If people who live in there are still low income and can't move up, it's like, that's what has really changed. You just polished it up and made it look nice, right? So, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so can you talk a little bit, you mentioned this before, but with outside of Providence, having other towns, I mean, even nationally, just the having where people are, where cities have to build some low-income housing. If that was expanded, I think there was some program federally that just got, or a policy maybe that just got cut by the Trump administration. Can you talk a little bit about how important that is to have all towns around Rhode Island, all towns around, all different types of communities have to have low-income housing so that people can, spread out and live in many places.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely complicated. I think there is a 10% year-round affordable housing loose mandate at the state level, right? So every place is expected to have 10% all year round affordable housing, and that pegging that affordability rate is hard. We always talk about low income, very low income. These are the folks making $10,000 to $20,000 a year with families, fixed incomes, because I think affordable becomes skewed when you look at the income ranges from here to New Bedford, right? Mm-hmm. So I think the median income of Rhode Island hovers around $70,000 a year for an individual, which is just wildly out of touch with the folks we deal with. So I think that we emphasize low and very low income housing. Our members do, for sure, every time affordable comes up. And then I think it's particularly in the Black members who come from the Black community, right, who have generations of being descendants of slaves in America. It's a sort of a toss-up. I hear these things about how much of a failure desegregation was, and being sent to the white school entailed all these other traumatic things and all this other heightened racism that folks almost felt like they were better off in an all Black community where they controlled their own stuff, So I really feel that argument, and I've heard it so often that, and seeing the reality, it rings true. Because when I always wonder, even if someone could take their voucher to Burrillville, for instance, would they want to take their Black family to Burrillville and rent an apartment that was not great by Burrillville standards? They're not moving into a single family house on a bunch of acres, right? And go into a school system with all these racist kids, right? Like, I don't know what that would be like as a white person, but I imagine the struggle of thinking, well, think about all these opportunities my kids will have, or all these things I could access, but at the same time, you really can't, right? There's a superficial sense of access, and then there's this fear that's heightened now in the right-wing backlash situation we're in now, that there's a lot of other risks involved in that, right? You're much less secure. You've lost your social foundation, you've lost your connections, you've lost maybe services you relied on, trusted organizations like D.A.R.E. You're kind of moving out into the white woods of sorts. Yeah. And I don't know a lot of D.A.R.E. members that would want to do that without other things in place. Yeah. I think that the failure of Reconstruction is real. I think that at that time, after the Civil War, is recognized that was a project, right? And that would take force. It would take a fundamental restructuring of a lot of things. And I think we saw the quick kibosh put on that program. And I think we still have to do it, right? And I don't think it's enough to make it discrimination to not take voucher holders. It's not enough to say you should have 15% of your housing year round or 10, 15, 20, 30 affordable housing, because I grew up in Bristol and I know that they have 10% affordable housing, but it's just old white folks in the nursing home, right? And they can write that off as affordable housing, and they don't have to create any situation where lower income folks of color can move in and actually live there, and really live and thrive and be represented, kind of like not live on the margins and in constant fear of being out there in any form or another. So I think it's a much bigger project. We've advocated that cities should be punished for not having housing. They should have state funds withheld. There should be a lot more sticks and less carrots and nice talk. But at the same time, it has to be comprehensive. I think that's really one of the fundamental struggles, is that we get these case studies and sort of study commissions, and no one ever comes up with a fundamental approach to desegregating Rhode Island. They want to change the name again, and it's great. But like if Burrville continues to operate like a plantation, it doesn't matter if it's called a plantation, right? So I think that's the struggle. These one-off legislation, even the creating of a discriminatory class for income, is going to be superficial if people can't win a discrimination case. And that's notoriously difficult in the legal system, even when it's overt racism or it's overt sexism, right? Even then, with all the laws we have, people don't even take it to court, right? They don't believe that the legal system is going to weigh in on their side. I think we have to hold those things in our mind when we approach desegregation, or we approach fair housing, right?
Yeah. So my question was this: so is there a case study of a city in America or two case studies, right? One that's doing a really good job at fixing this, and then like the worst situation. What is like the worst situation possible? Like San Francisco or something. Obviously, it's very bad, but like somewhere where gentrification is horrible, rents are crazy high, and just people can't live, and then somewhere where like they're doing the right thing and they're making things work.
Yeah, the positive case, I always like to point to Jackson, Mississippi and the Jackson Plan. I think that the South is a very different context, a very important context to look at. Black folks there doing their own organizing, taking over. And Jackson, too, also has an incredible comprehensive plan, right, that includes electoral work and taking over local government, and also in doing reparations in different ways. I do think that a place like Boston is a great example of where people are doing awesome organizing work, but remains so deeply segregated, right? And remains so deeply reliant on university development and high-end development and, just exploitative capitalist development that, it's a good case study for us to look at, to say, well, this is where we could go. Is this where we want to be? Is this level of segregation and, just exploitation and deep poverty in certain neighborhoods and for people of color where we want to end up? Or do we want to take a different path? Because we're really on the verge of that gentrification. We have it at a different level. We have it in different form. And I think there's an opening to regulate it, right? And slow the tide down and to really house our folks. Yeah,
great. Well, we're all out of time, Christopher. Thank you so much for coming. It was enlightening. I'm glad we get to talk. I'm glad people get to see this and hear about these problems.
Yeah, thanks so much for the time. Appreciate it.
Oh yeah, no problem. Have a great day.
You too.
And thank you everybody for watching, and make sure you tune in again for another episode of Headway.